will. It's a lack of personnel. It's a lack of funding on the DOE side. So you have these contractors that essentially run the show out there. Every aspect of the cleanup has to go through review process. Bechtel, for instance, with this waste treatment plant, there's, literally hundreds of different aspects to this project. Each one of those aspects has to go through a review process. Well, at the end of the day, the Department of Energy gets to green light it or not, right? Well, when they don't have the right amount of staffing to look at this stuff, the amount of technical staff, Bechtel can just push through bad ideas after bad idea, and obviously that's been the case, right? We haven't seen this stuff being cleaned up. So I don't think it's a lack of expertise necessarily among those that actually work there, but it's a lack of people in general, just headcount, right? And it's the fact that Bechtel runs the show. So that's one of the big concerns that under the Trump administration, just like the EPA was gutted, the Department of Energy was gutted, the funding being slashed. Meanwhile, the contracts keep ballooning. So it's a really, really big problem, and the whole system out there needs to change if we're going to see this get to a better place one day.
So you think there actually are technical solutions to safely storing this waste?
I think we all have to hope that there is. I don't know if there's not obviously an easy answer, else this would have been done already. Just last fall, they had spent millions of dollars to build this facility that was going to do, a test run for vitrification, for turning this into glass. They had a ribbon cutting ceremony. It was a big deal, right? Well, 1 week in, the thing overheated, and they had to go back to the drawing board. And this is just one instance. I mean, it's case after case of this kind of botched work. And I think that we all have to hope that it gets to a place where this stuff is stored safely, that we need to get this waste out of these tanks. There are a lot of really, I'm obviously very critical of the cleanup operation in Bechtel in particular, and the Department of Energy hasn't always done a great job, obviously. But I think at the end of the day, we all want the same thing, right? And I don't think anybody would say, hey, if it costs $1 trillion to clean this up, let's spend it. Let's get this stuff so we don't have a horrible accident out there. However, if instead of that happening, it's just about profit motives, getting paid not to get the job done, as Walter Tamasitis has told me, that's a problem. It's a problem because we're paying for it. Taxpayers are paying for it.
Now, Handford is not the only nuclear waste storage site. There's 90 nuclear reactors that have waste stored on site. Each of them has problems with erosion or earthquakes or terrorism or whatever. And you hear people making the claim that nuclear power is the solution to our climate crisis.
Right.
What's your response to that?
Well, even if we are supposed to, let's just for a minute believe hypothetically that everything that nuke boosters tell us is true, that everything about it's safe, right? Which it isn't. It doesn't have any carbon emissions in any part of the life cycle. If that were true, it isn't, but let's pretend that it is. If uranium mining is totally safe, let's pretend that that's true. It's not. Let's pretend that that's true. You still have, and if there is an answer for the waste, right? There's not an answer for the waste, but let's pretend that there is. Even if all these things, let's just give them all of that. It's still not going to be done in time, right? You can't roll out enough plants fast enough to impact the climate crisis. It's just not going to happen. It's too expensive. It takes 10 to 15 years to get these things online. There's a big push for small modular reactors. Well, even those are very, very expensive, and there's a lot of questions about if they're going to get up and running in time. They're not. So I mean, I can throw the kitchen sink at it, but it's there's a lot of issues. but in relation to Handford, for me personally, the waste issue is something that just there is no answer for. There is nothing, no place that you can put this stuff for hundreds of thousands of years and keep it safe. If we're concerned about the future of the planet because of the climate, which ought to be, we ought to be also concerned about leaving a toxic legacy behind. If we can save the climate with nuclear reactors, which we can't, you're going to create so much waste that you're going to poison the planet anyway, right? So how can that possibly be a solution?
Yeah.
You have a plant, I think it's in Connecticut right now. They have waste that they've been trying to figure out what to do with for a long time. They just came up with this plan to store this stuff safely, right? It took them a long time to come up with this plan, lots and lots of money. And they admit that it's only a temporary solution and that these facilities aren't going to be ready for storage for 10 to 15 years. There's no answer for this stuff. And that's a really, really big problem. That's what I take away from the Handford mess, is that any solution still comes with a lot of question marks.
So in terms of the climate crisis, if we spent the amount of money that we would need to spend on nuclear to make a dent in it, on things like wind and solar, could we have a much quicker solution?
Oh, certainly. But that's not to say that those don't come with problems as well, especially when we are, this gets into a different type of conversation perhaps, but we need to decentralize the grid. I think that we can't let these companies put solar panels in areas of pristine habitat. We need to be very concerned about the mining of minerals. Lithium mining and those sorts of things have really grave impacts. The thing that we really need to talk about really is degrowth. We need to talk about the fact that we've reached our limit with consumption in this country and the world, that we need to reassess and reevaluate our habits. I'm very excited that we're going to get rid of combustion engines, right? In California, we're going to have EVs. Great, that's fantastic. But if we're replacing those with batteries, and the mining of which is in Chile, in Brazil, in Bolivia, is causing environmental devastation in those communities, or even here in the Sierra Nevada or out in the Salton Sea in California, is that a good answer? We need to think about restructuring our cities. We need to think about getting out there and making walkable communities, bikeable communities, and really a restructuring of our whole society.
Clearly a circular economy where we recycle more and consume less is a great idea. But in terms of lithium production for batteries, right here in Southern California, out in the Salton Sea, we have a very clean source of lithium. It doesn't require deep mining. It's available in the waste product of a energy plant out there that is a geothermal plant. And
right.
So it could be a great prospect for a renovation of the economy out in a very impoverished area. So I personally have some optimism about gaining lithium from that. And I think disposal of batteries and such is a problem. But when it comes to climate change or it comes to nuclear waste, that seems like a pretty small problem, doesn't it?
At this point it does, but if but for instance, just as you, and I don't necessarily disagree with you about the Salton Sea, there is a problem with how much water they're going to have to use for that. But meanwhile, they're opening up prospective mining in Thacker Pass, this very pristine habitat up in the Sierras. So, it still is an extractive process. And while the good thing is in this country, we do have very good regulations. They could be a lot better. But a lot of the places where they're sourcing this material, in South America, there's that's where 2/3 of lithium is held,
right,
and reserves there in deposits, and copper as well, which is a huge product, and horrible mining goes in. Copper mining has horrible effects, especially open pit mining. So there's just a lot of these kind of things that we need to talk about as environmentalists as well. But going back to waste and nuclear waste, none of this poses the same long-term problems as storing or dealing with waste. Not only can it be, leaking, underground leaking and getting into groundwater supplies, you can also be using this stuff in a dirty bomb, and what is the global landscape going to look like in 20 years, 100 years, let alone, 10,000 years, if this stuff can then, be re-refined and used in atomic bombs, which it can. I mean, once it goes through the fission process in a reactor for energy, it doesn't have that much further to go to be made into a bomb. So you're almost, you're doing all the legwork for these places. So that's a big concern of mine as well.
Okay, for those that are just joining us, our guest today is Joshua Frank. He is a award-winning journalist and also has graduate degrees in environmental conservation. So we think he probably knows what he's talking about here. He's just written a fabulous book called Atomic Days, the Untold Story of the Most Toxic Place in America, which is the Handford nuclear site in Western Washington. Bart is holding up a copy of the book. I urge you to pick it up. It's a fabulous piece of journalism. And it is journalists that often are the whistleblowers and the watchdogs over private companies and government agencies that are really not doing the job they need to. So I'm going to turn it over to Bart. Bart, do you have a question, or do we have any other listeners that are potentially asking questions now?
Yeah, let me see Q&A. We have a couple of questions. I'll start with an anonymous attendee. Has the Handford site impacted nearby communities, and what are some of the long-term effects? Which is what you already sort of addressed. And I'm thinking, have they measured radioactivity in the wine yet? Is there monitoring on the river in continuous manner so that people can know when it spikes up or whatever?
So I'll talk a little bit about that in a second, but I think it's really important to understand how radioactive materials accumulate in the body, right? So it bioaccumulates in your muscles and in your tissues and in your bones. Over time, the more that you're exposed, the greater your risk of developing a myriad of different types of cancers, other types of illnesses. During the operation of Handford, as I mentioned before, there was intentional releases of radioactive materials. The big one that we know about was called the Green Run, where they intentionally released iodine-131 into the air. There's still a lot of debate about the real intention of why they did this, but ultimately it was for testing purposes. Now, whether or not it was to test it as a weapon, or if it was to test its impact on people, we don't really know. But this release was a huge mess, obviously. And the downwind communities were completely unaware that this was happening. We know from some of those, at least anecdotal studies and qualitative, research has shown that the communities that were impacted by this, the Green Run, and then also just living in the vicinity of Handford, had high levels of thyroid cancers and rheumatoid arthritis, especially among the Yakima Nation, indigenous peoples that lived very close by. So, the government hasn't gone in and done the really long longitudinal studies. And some of the problem is, like, a lot of this stuff, the people from, back in the 60s, a lot of those people that were exposed are no longer around. So that's a big problem as far as research goes. And of course, the government doesn't want to admit any of this stuff. I mean, the information about the Green Run, this didn't even come out until the 80s. We didn't really know about it. And that wasn't the only intentional release. And then, of course, we have all these accidental releases as well. And those are the accidents, right? That's not even just talking about living around something like this. Today, they do monitor, but they monitor mostly on site, and it's for safety purposes for the workers. There are thousands of workers out there that are working in the most dangerous jobs we have in this country, I would argue, or right up there. I mean, they're working around in facilities that are radioactive. They're exposed consistently to chemical vapors. There were, hundreds of millions of gallons of chemical vapors were produced, or chemical products were produced that were dumped literally into the soil out there. So we have that problem. But no, there isn't consistent testing of radioactive soil contamination in and around the region that there should be. You have the central Washington area, and then also over into Idaho, huge agricultural region. Not just wine. Obviously, wine is one that I'm probably most fond of, but they're not testing the wine, and it's a problem, right? I think if we had more of an awareness, we would know that this is still around. I mean, cesium, for example, that was released into the environment, it grows up in these plants, right? It's in plants on the Handford Reservation that are being eaten by coyotes. The coyotes and the deer on the reservation have shown high levels of radioactivity. Maybe they're not as high as the dogs around Chernobyl, but it's pretty high. So what is that exposure for people in the region? But there's a lot of denialism as well. And then there's a fervent patriotism that runs through the culture of Richland. It's a very conservative town, but it boasts the most PhDs per capita in the entire country. And so it's a very educated town, but it's bizarre. It is kind of a bizarre place to go and spend time in. The high school mascot is the Bombers. They celebrate the atomic age, and they really believe, especially the older generation, that no matter how bad Handford is now, it was worth it because it ended World War II. It produced one of the fuel for the bomb that was dropped on Nagasaki. So they still believe, even though, of course, we can get into all of that. If that was even necessary, it wasn't, of course. And there's no, memorial for the Japanese that perished. There is still this. It almost runs like a covert military town today, or a military town today, because it is in many ways still a covert military operation. It's now a cleanup, but it was shrouded in secrecy for so long that has carried over into the culture today. So it's really a bizarre thing. But to go back to your question, I think because of that sort of cultural apathy to the potential dangers, there isn't an appetite to test and to be concerned about exposure, right? Because that would really challenge their whole worldview in a way.
These nuclear issues turn up again and again at Santa Susana and at Handford and at Rocky Flats and at nuclear plants throughout the United States. And hypothesize with me, which is the problem here? Is it ignorance on the part of government officials? Is it collusion on the part of political officials? Is it too controversial to touch, or some of all of those?
You're talking about just
I'm talking about
the atomic project in general?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, well, at the government level, to really address this stuff would to address American supremacy, right? I mean, the Cold War was propped up by nuclear powers, and that arsenal still, even though it was cut, in the 80s, it's still very large today. We have a potential confrontation with Russia and NATO, not to mention the risks of Zaporizhia and depleted uranium that is going to be shipped from Britain. So all of these issues, I think, benefit Western supremacy because they are propped up by our nuclear arsenal. So to challenge this stuff is to challenge that, right? And then I think at a very basic level, there is a lot of ignorance and there is a lot of control of the information by those that want to prop this up. But on a scaling back a little bit on the energy issue, I do like to give people the benefit of the doubt. I mean, we can go back to what we were talking about with atomic energy as an answer, potential answer for climate change. I think a lot of people, especially younger generation, are captivated by the idea that there's a technical solution to this problem, that there's just, let's make these plants, let's get them up and running and get rid of coal and natural gas. And this is great, right? Sounds like something out of the Jetsons, like the future is right here. And we've had this technology all along. Why aren't we utilizing it? So I think that that's captivating for people because they're rightfully scared about climate change. However, they don't know all of the history of the anti-nuke movement, of what they accomplished. They don't truly understand the risks. They don't really understand what happened to Chernobyl. We have cover-ups after cover-up with Fukushima. And you fast forward to Ukraine. I mean, there are just so many problems. And that goes to, I think, the fact that nuclear energy and weapons and all, it's very complicated stuff when it gets down to, and on the scientific level, it's a lot easier to understand, even a combustion engine. But what happened? What is fission? Like, what is fusion? How does this work? What is waste? What do you mean there's waste? I thought there was, there's a lot of components to it that I think a lot of people aren't aware of, right? And of course, the boosters don't want to talk about waste. So if you read, I know there was an op-ed in the New York Times last week of this, somebody, I think it's called the green nuclear energy deal, Green New Deal, whatever, something crazy. And it's just completely full of propaganda. Oliver Stone just has released a new documentary and about talking about how great nuke energy is. Completely bonkers stuff. And he's at least honest that he's like, I'm not, I put no critics in my, you're not going to hear any of the dissenting voices in my film about this, right? So it's pure propaganda, but that's, a lot of people eat that up because.
Josh, would you just say that the reasons that we have problems right now with the development of nuclear energy is that, number one, it's uneconomic to date, right?
Yeah,
it doesn't
certainly
compare with what Lazard said a year or two ago, that solar, wind, and batteries are 3 or 4 times cheaper, right? 4-fold cheaper. And also, there's no way that nuclear energy could be deployed in 2035 in time for the global warming to really kick in a serious manner. So that and we have 10 years to solve the problem, and you put up a solar farm or a wind farm in a couple of years, right? So, and the other thing is, we still don't know what to do with the waste. I'm open for nuclear energy and fission and fusion to happen, but it doesn't look like we just need more research, I guess. But for a solution oriented, look, you're talking about 584 square miles. You talk about, this would be some of the biggest solar. There's not a lot of wind there, but a lot of sun, but there's a lot of wind. What do you think could be a solution to provide enough energy to help transform Handford from the most toxic place in America, probably rating in the world, to something that can be cleaned up while they produce clean, green energy? What do you think?
I like your visionary idea. There's a lot of, the site itself is so radioactive. But with that said, there still is a lot of biodiversity in the land, right? Once humans are removed from a landscape, animals and plants flourish. And I would be skeptical of just covering it all with solar panels. I don't know if that's a good solution. I don't know if it's a safe solution, honestly. I wish there was an easy solution. I know one thing that is a fact is that we have a lot of buildings in Southern California and all over the coast that could have solar panels. I don't think that we need to essentially pave over the wild regions, especially in the West, because that's where they exist the most to solve the climate crisis. I think we need to work on efficiency. I think we need to descale. I think that we need to make it easier for people to put solar panels on their roofs. The Governor Newsom's done quite the opposite and made it harder. There's a lot of solutions I think that can have a minimal impact, and those would be the ones that I'd be the most interested in. As far as Handford, Handford was never producing energy, right? It was producing fuel for bombs. And I get this question a lot. Well, isn't that different than producing energy? I mean, it's a completely different thing. No, actually, it's really not. Plutonium is a byproduct of the fission process, right? So whether you're producing energy or you're producing it for fuel purposes, it's still being produced through the fission process. It's being produced in all reactors in the world today, and in all reactors in the future, small modular reactors, anything else, still produces plutonium. The ones at Handford were extra refined, so that it was better for fuel for a bomb. But they all produce this stuff, and it's all going to be around for 250,000 years. It's crazy. Just I think that sometimes numbers sort of like cloud reality, and we start, they just kind of like go, get washed over us, and we don't really think about what does that really mean. Well, to put it in perspective, humans have only been roaming outside of Africa for like 60,000 years. And think of all the societies that have risen and fallen and crumbled, and that's only 60,000 years. Plutonium, if it had been around then, would still be radioactive for another 190,000 years from now, right? So it's crazy stuff. And I think from a human perspective, a very human perspective, in our great energy revolution that is happening now, I think we need to really look at who profits from this. I think that we really need to be advocates for the least impactful solutions possible. And I think that we need to come together and oppose the most horrific of those ideas. And one of those is atomic energy. Atomic energy has no place in any green portfolio for our future whatsoever.
Well spoken, Josh. Peter, were you going to say something?
Well, I was just going to say, I was a co-author along with 12 others of the National Sierra Club guidance on nuclear waste. And I would concur exactly with what you say. The risks are monumental. With regard just to nuclear sites that generate energy, we've got 90 of those around the country, all stored with nuclear waste, either in cooling pools or in dry storage, right, that are vulnerable to earthquakes, tsunamis, climate change, sea rise, terrorism. I could go on and on with that list.
Yeah.
But they're very vulnerable. The odds of all of them surviving even our remaining lifetimes are not great. So I would completely concur, based on our extensive research at Sierra Club, with what you're saying.
Well, thanks so much for your research, and I've sourced it quite a few times in different projects I've worked on. I think this conversation changes a lot too if we were to see a disaster at Zaporizhzhia tomorrow. I mean, again, even if all of the propaganda that they throw at us is true, the matter of fact is atomic energy plants in the war zone pose great risks.
Terrible.
And Taiwan it might be the next frontier for some kind of conflict. They have nuke plants. This is a whole new tool of war now, and Russia's using it to their advantage to control and potentially take that region. But what are the impacts? And if there is an accident, and it doesn't have to be that one of these plants gets hit with a projectile. It could be that they lose power and their backup generator fails. And I've written about the potential for these really old school Soviet diesel generators that aren't that efficient that could poop out. And then what? Then you have a meltdown. Then you basically have what happened at Fukushima. Of course, Russia knows this because they're going to get a lot of the radioactive fallout from that kind of accident. But these are grave risks. I mean, nuke plants in general are grave risks. The Diablo plant up the coast from us, extension of that life was one of the greatest failures of the Gavin Newsom administration, in my view.
Absolutely.
And if tomorrow there's an earthquake and we see something horrific happen in San Luis Obispo and off the coast and spreads to the central California and across the country, it changes again, right?
A little dent at any presidential aspirations, huh?
Absolutely. And if you go back even to all of the great things that the anti-nuke movement accomplished in this country and putting the brakes on essentially the entire plan to build hundreds of nukes across the country, they were also aided by the disaster of Chernobyl. And I fear that I don't want to see that happen. I don't want to see an accident happen and that be the reason why more people come on our side. I really don't. Same with Handford. I would probably be on, CNN tomorrow if there's a big accident out there, and I don't want to be. I'd rather not be.
Josh, speaking of accidents waiting to happen, I'm talking to you about 30 miles, 35 miles from a place called San Onofre. And there's a whole group of people down here working on that. There's even outreach from Mothers for Peace who have their own problem with Diablo Canyon restarting. But there's, San Clemente Green and public watchdogs, and there's a lot of people trying to deal with that. Let me get some questions from the audience about containment. There's a masterful woman named Donna Gilmore who's about the containers that are the warranty have a 25-year warranty. They're 5/8 thin stainless steel. How do those containers compare to the single wall containers at Handford?
Well, they're a lot newer. That's one of the problems. I mean, and also one of the biggest problems with the Handford tanks is that the stuff in these tanks, and each one of these tanks is different. So it's not only the radioactive stuff that's eating away at the bottoms of these tanks, it's all the chemical waste as well. So you have just the leaching problem in these tanks varies from tank to tank. So whereas these new tanks that she's talking about, they're obviously made, I would say they're probably made better. They still have their problems, but the ones at Handford are literally sitting in soil that's been sitting in now since the 50s, and they're corroding. I mean, the bottoms of these single-shelled tanks are corroding. That's why they started making the double-shelled tanks, but that wasn't until the 70s. They were just had these single-shelled tanks. And they were creating so much waste when they were making plutonium that these tanks were literally like overflowing into the one. So when one would fill up, it'd fill up the next one and fill up the next one and fill up the next one. It was just constantly overflowing, basically. And today we're just dealing with the aftermath of that.
So we've learned nothing, sort of. I mean, what has San Onofre learned? What has Diablo Canyon learned from Handford?
That's a good question. I think what we've learned from the outside is that this stuff poses really, really grave risks to us all. Sano is one of my favorite places to surf, and I'm paddling out at Old Man's, and you look up at the plant, and I worry. Did they just flush water out of that thing? I don't know. I'm just hope for the best. It's a problem, but imagine if the pro-nuke folks had their way, we'd have these plants up and down the coast. We'd have them along rivers. But I would remind, I'm sure we're in friendly territory now, but when these conversations come up, remind people, look at what happened to France last summer. France basically so France is looked at as like the ideal nuclear powered country in the world. Well, last summer they had to take half their plants offline during an enormous heat wave. And why? Well, some of them were corroding, so they had to take those offline because they weren't safe. But a lot of them were taken offline because the rivers that they were drawing water from were too warm and too low to cool the reactors down. So you're going to make plants to combat climate change, yet climate change is going to heat the rivers, so you can't use the reactors. It's like like scientific, it's like science fiction stuff. It's crazy.
So with regard to the water off San Onofre, Bart and the Coalition for Nuclear Safety has documented dozens of liquid batch releases from San Onofre into the Pacific Ocean under the theory that dilution is the solution.
Right.
And so that is one issue. But the other issue is that there is not a long-term solution for storage. As Bart has said, at San Onofre and at other nuclear power plants throughout the country, these thin-walled casks do not last forever, especially in marine environments subject to corrosion and wind and such. And then finally, the threat of terrorism is omnipresent with all of these nuclear sites. We think San Onofre's guarded well, but in all the guardhouses, you don't know if they're occupied or not. And that's
well, I think about that with Handford. And I've thought about it for a long time with Handford, even though it's very secure. I mean, what was it? Just a few months ago, we had those crazy Chinese weather balloons, right? Or the balloons that came over.
Right.
And you think, well, what if a drone went in there and attacked one of these tanks? Then what happens? You know, there's just so many different scenarios for stuff to go wrong with this. I mean, no other energy source poses these kind of risks.
And risk management requires understanding the worst case scenarios, not panaceas and BS.
But if we were to listen to the Nuclear Regulatory Commission about all of the risks, I mean, they say something like there's a 1 in 154 chance that a plant's going to have a meltdown. Well, we've already had how many meltdowns since we started this whole project in this for human society? We've had like 5, if you include, each reactor that melted down at Fukushima. So what does that mean for the future? And what did we learn from this? We certainly didn't learn much. I'm really concerned right now about India. And they have horrible regulations, which has actually made nuke energy cheaper than other stuff like solar, for instance, per kilowatt hour. And the reason is because they don't have really any strict regulations whatsoever. There's a reason why we don't drive cars made in India in this country. They don't all have any of the, some of them don't have seatbelts. Some of them don't have, airbags. So being in, constructing new plants under these kind of scenarios is really frightening stuff. It's really frightening stuff. And it doesn't solve the climate crisis.
Josh, let me integrate some of the audience. There's some fantastic questions coming in, and some that you've already answered. Like, in your research, did you come across any evidence of efforts to cover up the dangers posed by the Handford site or downplay the severity of the environmental contamination? Do you have a quick answer for that one that you haven't already shared with us?
Yeah. Well. Yes, there was. So in the 80s, late 80s, Handford, and early 90s, Handford was being considered as a site that they wanted to send more waste to. Even though they already had all this waste, I think that they were kind of like, well, it's already so bad. Let's just keep shoveling stuff over there, right? Well, the local Yakima Nation basically was like, wait a second, hold on. We're right here. You're not going to come through our lands to come and drive through and dump this stuff. One advocate, Russell Jim, who I have a chapter dedicated to him in the book, who was a wonderful man. He died maybe 5 years ago now, and I had the chance of meeting him and interviewing him. He almost single-handedly is the reason why we know about the Green Run and all these other accidents and events that happened out there. When he was fighting to stop Handford becoming a garbage bin for more waste, he was out in Washington lobbying. He spoke on Capitol Hill, and he essentially stopped Handford, along with other advocates, from becoming a future waste depository. Unfortunately, that waste went to Rocky Flats and elsewhere, but it stopped Handford for the moment. But because of that, and because of a lot of lawsuits and a lot of the accountability that came out of his efforts, we learned about a lot of this stuff, a lot of these cover-ups. But it wasn't until the 80s that we learned about this in the 90s, when tens of thousands of documents were released. And under the Clinton administration, even more were released. But the floodgates opened because of Russell Jim. So I think it's important, a lot of this stuff gets it's pretty dire, you can get angry, you can get frustrated, you can get concerned, but there are a lot of people that are fighting the good fight up there, just like here in California, the work that you all are doing. The Columbia Riverkeeper is a great organization up there that's doing great work and trying to hold these agencies and these contractors' feet to the fire. You have Handford Challenge up in Seattle that is helping and protecting whistleblowers and trying to draw attention to this issue. So there are a lot of local organizations, and not to mention the continued efforts of the Yakima Nation that are really embodied the spirit of Russell Jim today and are still really concerned. And there's no major decisions that can happen out at Handford without a seat at the table for indigenous tribes.
Good. So that means that they won't take the San Onofre nuclear waste.
That's correct.
3.5 million, 3.6, 3.55 million pounds, and put it on a barge and truck it up the Columbia to your dump site,
Yeah.
which is good. And that's it reminds me of Ken Cook with the Environmental Working Group, how they helped shut down Yucca Mountain was also because they did a study groups in Salt Lake City and said, do you want to have a repository for nuclear waste? And everyone said, absolutely, we do. And then they said, do you want to have thousands of truckloads of nuclear waste running, within 50 miles of your community? And that's when Yucca Mountain was successfully closed. I have another question from Nathan Bouton. Can you expand on the closed cultural loop that exists within those circles of highly educated nuclear physicists? Do those scientists think that they can be the one to solve the problem, whether that be the cleanup, global warming, et cetera? And how does that hubris translate to today's billionaires now investing in nuclear energy? Which reminds me of the $231 million that New York Times article I can't seem to find, but about two years ago, February, that Bill Gates was starting he's done so much good, but he's also involved with public relations for his nuclear power investment with the small modular nuclear reactors. You want to talk about the cultural loop at all?
Yeah, that's a complicated question. First, I would say that not all highly educated scientists and engineers that even nuclear and physicists are on board with atomic energy and atomic waste. A lot understand the dangers. They're not all Arnie Gundersons that are whistleblowers and came around. Some of them are, but there is a divide, I think, in the scientific community on this stuff. Those, however, that are working in plants, those that are working on new advanced technologies like fusion, I do believe that some of them believe the bullshit that they are spoon-fed in schools. And I think that they believe that there are technical solutions to the problems that we're facing, that we can continue to live the comfort in our capitalistic societies without there being any ramifications. And that's a big problem because it's not true. I mean, resources are scarce. Uranium is scarce. Metals for green technologies in some cases are very scarce. So there aren't those kind of solutions. But I think that a scientific mind sometimes fails to grasp the socio and economic realities that we face and the other factors that play into all of this, whether they're geopolitical or whether they're about waste. They would much rather talk about trying to find a solution for atomic waste than to talk about the dangers of it, right? For instance. So it's a change in perspective that's needed, because there are a lot of brilliant people that we need on our side to help us figure out what to do with the problems we've already created. And a lot of them are working on that. But we need to do that and not create a whole new slew of problems as well. So there's a cultural divide within the scientific community as well. But there's great organizations, one like Science for the People is a really great organization and has a lot of smart, intelligent scientists that and this isn't to say the Union for Concerned Scientists and lots of others that are really concerned about this stuff. So
Okay.
it's not all that are pro-nuke, that's for sure.
That's, I mean, and then there's another question about what about the people who do not own their homes, who can't cover their rooftops and solar? What should lower income citizens and families do to play their part to saving our planet? So I think since it's a little over an hour, help me with this one, Peter. Let's end on a positive note. Let's see what we can do to come up with knowing what we have. It's very important to know. And then the second thing would be what solutions can we offer people? How do they go about attending to the awareness that you've just shared?
Well, in terms of solar in disadvantaged communities or highly dense communities, we have to have community solar projects which build solar collectors over parking lots and on vacant land and over canals that bring water across California, which will both conserve water and generate power simultaneously. So these are possibilities. We also need both government and private agencies to fund greenhouse gas reduction programs, as the Sierra Club is attempting to do through the San Diego Foundation, which gives people grants especially in communities of concern, to do things like retrofit their homes and to build solar, or to get gas out of their homes and put in heat pumps and electric water heaters. So there's a plethora of solutions. We're not out of ideas. And it's been a great conversation today. I want to put in one last plug for Joshua and his book. His book is Atomic Days, the untold story of the most toxic place in America, the story of the Handford nuclear site in Western Washington. And on behalf of Samuel Lawrence Foundation and Josh and I want to thank you, Joshua, for being with us today and sharing your expertise.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. Yeah, just one last thing I would add to add on to what you're saying about what we can do. Let's just remember that the biggest polluters in this world are billionaires, and let's also remember that the biggest single polluter in the world is the U.S. military. So if we want to really look at the bigger problem, let's not blame individuals that are just trying to get by too, right? We do need those solar projects. We do need those things to happen. But the big polluters in this country are not, most of the renters of the world.
True.
Josh, this is just the beginning of a conversation, because I can see a lot more information sharing this way. I think our job as foundation is to just bring awareness to the problem most people don't know about. And thanks to you, and thanks to Peter, and thanks to a whole slew of the partners that we have in this, all the partners that decided to support this recording. We're going to do this again. Thanks a lot. Thank you very, very much.
Very honored to be here. Thanks so much for having me. Enjoy your weekends, everybody.
Thank you.